Tracy, and today I'm going to be doing a video talking about, and I was trying to phrase it like the best way I could, like trying to think about this title, but basically just about like how to edit like your EDH decks. Like say you're someone who, you know, and I mean most of us do this, where we edit our decks, where we say, hey, this card isn't working, like I need to trade it out with this one, but sometimes it can be tricky, and I always find that that's always been, I feel like, a challenge for a lot of people, is figuring out like what cards to take out and like what cards to put in, because, you know, yes, realistically there are some cards that you're like, cool, like this is a placeholder and I'm totally gonna get another, you know, a card that does something else that's just totally different from, you know, this one card, it's junk, I need something else kind of thing. But honestly, there should be a lot more thought that goes into it with how to like edit cards. So these are a couple of things that I've realized over the years of like editing my decks and basically how to do it. So the first thing is trading off like type. So say in your deck, and these are just cards, I'm not saying you should trade these cards out because I talked about two cards I really enjoy. Say you're running a Kese Cage Breakers in your deck, which I love this card. This card's sweet. You should always run this card if you can. But then say you're like, I also have like this Oblivion Ring. Now these are two completely different cards. They do two completely different things. One of them's 5 mana, one of them's 3 mana, one of them's a creature, one of them's enchantment. They're also different colors, like different mana costs, you know, things like that, which is like super, the type, but you know, the type of these cards basically is like super, important, is that you're trading out like a creature to put in an enchantment. So something I always found like with EDH decks is, you know, a lot of people like struggle with like how much of this, how much of that, you know what I mean? Like as kind of my rule of thumb, I do like generally like 35 lands. That tends to be like my sweet spot. And then creatures, it just depends. Sometimes I do 30, sometimes I do 35. You know, I don't usually get below 30, but it depends, because if you're running a deck that is more combo based, you don't really need as many creatures. Or, you know, it depends on like how you're trying to win. Are you trying to win off creature damage? You know, do you have an infinite combo? Like, you know, are you more control? Like what are you kind of doing? But yeah, so anyways, with these two cards as an example, the types of them are totally different, and that's something that I would totally look out for. I always like to do that. I always like to generally try to trade out creatures for creatures, because then like once you start knocking down creatures, then you're like, oh wow, I only have like 20 creatures in my deck. Why am I not drawing any? Well, because you don't really have that many in your deck. So type is one thing. We talked about the whole mana. I mentioned the mana as well in that. 5 mana and 3 mana, it may not seem like a huge difference. You're like, okay, sweet, it's like 2 mana, like whatever. But it is a difference, and it's gonna throw off your curve, especially depending on how many cards you're editing in your deck at a time. So going from 5 to 3 can definitely be a big difference, so I would definitely pay attention to mana costs. Just throwing out like a different example here is, say you're running this awesome card called Solemn Simulacrum. I love this card, I think this card's sweet. And then you're like, hey, I want to throw a Progenitus in there. Well, okay, there's like a million things that are different. So yes, you're trading out creature for creature, but you're going from like, you're going from 4 mana to like 10 mana, plus you're going from all colorless mana to all colored mana. This is like a huge change, definitely something. And listen, I'm not saying if you want to put out Solemn Simulacrum and then put in Progenitus, like, hey, you know, nothing's stopping you, bro. Do whatever you want. I mean, you should probably run both, because both these cards are sweet. But, Solemn Simulacrum just does like a ton of different things and gets you mana and gets you your draw card. Card's sweet. But just something to pay attention to is that curve. That's going to now toss off your entire curve because you're running something that's 10 mana. And then I guess I'll just mention colors, because I just, Progenitus is a really great example because it's like all the colors. It's like a really huge thing to keep in mind. If you're putting something in that's like one color, or Solemn Simulacrum, it's colorless, and then you're going from one color to, or no colors, to like all the colors, it's going to totally throw off your mana base. You're going to totally have to adjust that, because now you have to accommodate, okay, I'm running all these different types of symbols. And with these examples that I'm giving and stuff, this is like going under the assumption that you're changing multiple cards in a deck, because that's at least how I find it. I feel like more people usually do that. Like, I don't think a lot of people, and maybe I'm wrong, but a lot of people don't usually get like one card and change it out. Like, unless you're super happy with the deck and you're pretty set, but like in the beginning stages when you're figuring out, like you're smoothing out all the kinks and stuff, like I think a lot of people try like changing like 5-10 cards. That's like a huge, you know, if you change like 10 cards, that's like 1/10 of your deck. That's like a huge change to change those amount of cards. So I should have added that in earlier, but I forgot. Okay, so this is, I would say, kind of the big deal, I would say. And this really goes into like, what does the card do? So say you have, I don't know, like Path to Exile. Path to Exile is like a removal card. That's what it does. That's what it does all day, every day. It just does its thing. But then say you're like, well, you know what, instead of running Path to Exile, I'm gonna run Queen Marchesa. Well, okay, well these cards do totally different things. So one, you're tossing off your mana base because you're going from like 1 mana to like 4 mana. Like, okay, you know, you're doing that, you're running more colors versus one colors, you're an instant versus creature, and what the cards do entirely different things. Now again, it's not to say that, you know, every time it should be removal for removal or something like that, but really looking at what those cards do, because now you're knocking down a removal card in your slots and you're bumping it up to a creature, you know, that sort of thing. So I think it's like really important to look at what exactly the cards do, just to see that for like, you know, changing out cards. But usually like what I've done in the past is I've usually like will go through my deck, or I've helped people out like a bunch of times where they've been like, hey, like what do you think I should take out of my deck? And I like fly through their deck and I like pull out cards that I don't like. And I think that's like a really good place to start, because I think sometimes what people do to edit decks is they get cards and they like don't think about what cards to take out. And I think it's really important because like sometimes your deck is like so great on its own that like edits are like really tough. Like you come to a certain point, which is like an awesome feeling because you're like, my deck functions so well and this is great, but like how do I edit it? Like what am I supposed to do? Like you get to a point where you're super happy with it and you're just like, I want to run all these sweet cards. And it's tough because like all these sets come out and you're like, but there's so much sweet stuff. Like how do I, you know, how do I like change up like all these cards? I think when you're editing your deck, take out those cards and really like look at your deck. And like one thing I think that's like really helpful to me is I use like Tapped Out, and I know some people use like other websites that basically just do the same thing as Tapped Out, but it's totally different when you actually like lay your deck down, like lay it out and like see what's going on with your curve. Because yeah, like the internet's gonna like tell you all that information, like use Tapped Out or whatever you use, but like physically laying it out yourself and like really seeing like, okay, what's going on here, you know? Oh, I noticed I have a ton of things at 6 mana, but like nothing at 4 mana, and that's like a huge issue because like I have not enough stuff in like my curve or like something like that. So yeah, I'd say with like editing, seeing what cards you know consciously, like, okay, make a list. I make lists all the time. I'm such a list person, it's how I am, and I'll write like cards I notice when I'm playing. Like that's another really huge thing too, is like when you're playing with these cards, like noting their effectiveness and like noting or their ineffectiveness, like this card's totally not working for me, to take it out. A lot of times like what happens, and I'm guilty of this too, where like you'll notice that but then like you won't do anything about it and you're like, okay, sweet, like I'll totally remember, then you don't. So like jot it down, like get like a notebook. This is my magic notebook and I write all my magic video ideas in here, and you know, I write in here like, you know, write in a notebook like, okay, this card was just totally not working, like I need to cut it. I noticed that my deck lacks removal. Or maybe you're like, I don't really know like what my deck needs, and then you kind of just look and find sweet cards and you're like, okay, you know, maybe I'll try this. But honestly, the thing that's really cool about deck building is that it's totally not permanent. Like if a card doesn't work, like you can just take it out. Like I think that's super cool, and like I guess like some people just like don't realize that, and I feel like it happens a lot with more the competitive scene, at least that I found, that a lot of people are like, oh, well, you're running this card and it's not gonna work. And it's like, well, let me like test the card out and like see if I like it. And a lot of it is like the synergy and the combination of cards. And like, honestly, I don't think there's like such thing as a perfect deck. Like I know a lot of these really competitive decks, people think they have them down to a science and everything's perfect and whatnot. But you know what? There's gonna be stuff coming out all the time, new magic cards all the time, new toys to play with, and decks are totally gonna evolve over time, and they're gonna change, and they're gonna get new cards, and old cards are gonna be removed and lost in the shuffle, and that's just how it goes. So that is it, guys. That is it for talking about like editing magic decks. I mean, this was more for like EDH, but I mean, I guess could be applicable to other formats too. I don't know. But hope you guys found this helpful, and I will see you in my next video.